I never thought my life would unravel in such a spectacularly cruel way. But if you had been standing in my shoes that night, you would have felt the same violent jolt in your chest when the truth finally tore through the illusion I had been clinging to for 20 years. Imagine sitting across the table from the man you built your entire adult life with, the father of your children, the person you thought would be your partner until the end. And suddenly, the little cracks in his face, the way his jaw twitches, the way he avoids your eyes, suddenly you just know that everything you thought you had was a lie. That was the Sunday night after dinner when I confronted my husband and watched my entire world collapse in silence, like a house of cards collapsing in slow motion. And here's the thing. I didn't even catch him red-handed. He didn't confess like some repentant sinner. It was messier, murkier, more soul-destroying than that. I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my bones for months, maybe even years. So I pushed and pushed until the truth leaked out in tiny, poisonous drops that never stopped burning. What would you have done in my place? Keep pressing or walk away before hearing the words that would haunt you? Forever. See, the truth was simple and devastating. He had been cheating on me. Not just a one-night slip, not just a drunken kiss at a work party. No, this was years. Years of deception, of stolen moments with an old girlfriend he had before he met me. The irony? She was the one who cheated on him and ghosted him back then. She was the one who left him broken. And when I entered his life, I thought I was building something real with him. Turns out he was never done with her. He let her crawl back in, and he kept her there, behind the curtains of our marriage, like a secret addiction he couldn't quit. The audacity of it still makes my blood boil. I remember begging him, pleading for our marriage to survive. I was humiliated, broken, raw. He was still messaging her on Snapchat like a giddy teenager, while I was curled up on the bathroom floor some nights, dry heaving from the weight of betrayal. I don't know if you've ever begged someone to love you while knowing they're already gone, but it's a kind of torture that carves scars into your soul. He finally ended it, or so he claimed. But even that came wrapped in lies. He trickled out pieces of the truth like breadcrumbs, feeding me just enough to keep me hooked, while hiding the full scope of his betrayal. And like a fool, I swallowed every crumb because I wanted so desperately to believe him. That's the part that haunts me most. How badly I wanted to believe. The other woman had been married when their affair began, and I still don't understand how her husband, the so-called other betrayed spouse, didn't think it was worth telling me. What kind of person stays silent when they know someone else's life is being torn apart in the shadows? He let me stumble through my days, oblivious, smiling at family dinners, planning vacations, while my husband was sneaking off to feed his ego with her attention. Years of this filth. And when the truth came out, my husband looked at me like I was the crazy one for not just moving on, for not sweeping it all under the rug and pretending we could go back to normal. But normal was dead. My health spiraled. I've always been athletic, sports, running, CrossFit, even Ironmans. I thrived on pushing myself. But after the betrayal, my body turned against me. I withered away, losing weight I didn't have to spare, then swung in the other direction, eating like I was still training while barely getting out of bed. I ballooned up, and every time I saw my reflection, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I was drowning, and nobody was coming to save me. The depression hit like a tidal wave. I went on antidepressants so strong that they numbed me to the core, but they also kept me alive. I'll be brutally honest here. One night I bought a rope. I thought about the beam in our garage. I thought about ending the unbearable silence in my head. I was that far gone. And my husband? Passive, detached, cold. He shut down every attempt I made to talk. He turned conversations into blank walls. He acted like I was the problem for even bringing it up. Can you imagine that? Someone rips your heart out of your chest, stomps on it, and then looks you in the eye and says, "Why can't you just let it go?" His mental gymnastics were Olympic level. He trickled truth me until I didn't know what was real anymore. He gaslit me with a blank face, no shame, no remorse. He even tried to blame me, said maybe if I had been more this or less that, he wouldn't have strayed. But I knew better. I had always been the one to initiate things, dates, conversations, intimacy, activities. He was the one turning me down 97% of the time. Looking back, I can't recall a single moment where he surprised me, went out of his way to show love, or did something special without me planning it first. And still somehow, I believed him when he said it was my fault. That's what trauma does to you. It twists your reality until you don't trust your own mind. And then, as if the betrayal of my husband wasn't enough, my own family decided to stab me in the back. During those months of hell, when I was desperate for support, my younger brother, the one I now call the rat, went behind my back and contacted my husband. He told him he was worried I was abusing him. Abusing him! Can you believe that? He saw the tail end of one heated argument, me shouting, yes, calling him names, and then storming out of the house to cool off. And from that one sliver, he built an entire fantasy where my cheating husband was a poor, battered victim trapped with me. My ex told him it wasn't true, but of course my brother kept pushing. And when my ex denied it passively without any conviction, my brother decided he must be covering for me. Instead of supporting me, my brother turned me into the villain. And because one betrayal wasn't enough, my mother decided to hop on his crusade. My mother, the queen of passive aggression, the gold medalist in mental gymnastics, the same woman who made excuses for people mistreating me when I was a child, was all too happy to believe I was the monster. Do you know what it's like to look at your own family, the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, and realize they would rather side with a cheating husband than with their own daughter? At first, I didn't know this was happening. I just noticed that every time I tried to talk to my mother, the conversations turned combative. She defended him. She made excuses. She painted me as the hysterical wife who just couldn't let things go. Meanwhile, I was begging her to be on my side, to at least see my pain. The breaking point came when my husband, sitting smugly in the room during one of my phone calls, finally came clean. He showed me the messages from my brother, my own flesh and blood conspiring against me. I blocked my brother, his wife, my parents, but before cutting them off, I poured my heart into an email, explaining how betrayed I felt, how much they had hurt me. And do you know what I got back? Nothing. Not a word. Months later, when my husband moved out, my mother, my own mother, called him. Not to tell him off, not to stand up for her daughter. No, she called to reassure him that she would always love him, that he was family, that she would be there for him. Can you imagine? That was the knife in the gut. That was the moment I realized my family wasn't just absent, they had chosen him over me. My husband, the man who betrayed me for years, was more worthy of their loyalty than I was. By then, I had filed for divorce. In my country, proof of infidelity speeds up the process, and I had it in black and white, screenshots, messages, the smoking gun. The divorce was uncontested, a clean 50-50 split. He didn't even fight for anything. And here's the sick twist. He didn't end up with her. After all the lies, the sneaking around, the years wasted, he didn't even pursue a relationship with his affair partner. Part of me was disappointed, honestly, because they deserved each other like poison deserves a wound. I tried dating afterwards, even had a short relationship. But my trust was shattered. Every smile, every promise, every touch felt like a setup for another knife in my back. I couldn't do it. Not then. Maybe not ever. Meanwhile, my ex drifted through life like the passive man he always was. He only ever acted when pushed. If I hadn't organized houses, cars, vacations, even repainting the living room, nothing would have happened. He was a passenger in his own life, letting me steer until he decided to veer off the road with her. I suspect he'll end up like his mother, alone, bitter, clinging to old regrets, and honestly, good. Let him rot in his passivity. As for me, I've been clawing my way out of the abyss. Off antidepressants since Easter, back in the gym, reconnecting with friends, starting a new job. Piece by piece, I'm rebuilding myself. The kids float between my house and his, but they stay here more often. Maybe because they sense where the life is, where the love is. I unblocked my parents 7 months ago, and they've made no attempt to reach out. No apology, no accountability, nothing. And it's bonkers, because I've always been the reliable one, the one who left home at 20, became independent, got my master's, built a career. My brother, the one they defend, he was a mess, breaking into schools at 13,
drinking, rehab stints. He only stabilized after meeting his now wife in rehab. And let's not forget, she was married at the time with 2 kids when she started an affair with him. That's the woman my family embraces. That's the son they believe over me. And the cherry on top? My parents bought half of his house to bail him out, while I've stood on my own 2 feet my entire life. So when I tell you I've been betrayed, not just by my husband, but by my entire family, I mean it. Every support system I thought I had crumbled. But I'm still standing. Barely at first, but stronger now. And I can't help but wonder, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have cut them all off sooner? Would you have fought harder for reconciliation? Or would you, like me, finally hit that breaking point where revenge doesn't just sound sweet? It becomes necessary. I could feel the edge of something shifting inside me. Not anger that was hot and blind, but a cold, patient kind of fury that organized itself into thought. You ever noticed how pain can sharpen you? It's like a lens that focuses everything down to one precise point. After months of being gaslit, lied to, and abandoned by the people who should have been my anchors, I stopped screaming into the void and started taking notes. I began to catalog. I began to plan. I didn't want to be a poster child for pity anymore. I wanted justice, not because I was trying to ruin someone for sport, but because there had to be consequences for trampling the life we'd built together. Consequences that would sting in the place where he and my family had decided their loyalty lived. Would you have let that slide? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? Or would you have done something the moment the betrayal hit? It's important here to tell you the first thing I did wasn't dramatic. I didn't smash his car or vomit on his new couch. I did paperwork. I breathed deep and turned my anger into precision. The earliest revenge is the one you don't announce. It's the quiet, methodical thing you do to make sure you survive, and then to make sure the person who hurt you can't hide behind excuses and silence. The first layer of my plan was simple: protect myself, legally and financially. That's not glamorous, but it's powerful. I reviewed every document, every joint account, every subscription. I duplicated what I needed, hidden copies, receipts, credit card statements. I stamped out the little vulnerabilities he might use to gaslight me later into thinking I had imagined things. While I prepared the administrative ground, my brain was doing other work in the dark. Memories that had been dulled by antidepressants and exhaustion started returning, clear and sharp. Little things. A missed birthday he blamed on being tired. The way he always had his phone face down. The small, annoyed sigh when I tried to hold his hand in public. The way he would smile with one corner of his mouth like a man who was practicing a performance. I saved every text I already had and went through conversations like a detective searching for pattern. I didn't want to make a spectacle. I wanted a record that could not be warped into some version of me being the villain. But emotional revenge needs rhythm. You can't just snap and expect catharsis. You have to build it. So I set myself 2 simultaneous goals: rebuild me and construct a pressure system that would, when released, make him and the family feel the force of what their choices had done. Rebuild, that was the personal work. Gym, diet, therapy.
Yes, real therapy this time. Friends who actually listened. Dental appointments I'd been putting off. Sleeping patterns. Rebuild meant getting back to the person he'd watched waste away. The woman who finished marathons and didn't cry at small provocations. The second goal, the pressure system, was strategy. It had to be nonviolent, legally defensible, and devastating in its social and emotional consequence. I wanted him to see what he had lost: dignity, respect, his false support system. I wanted my brother and my mother to see the consequences of siding with deceit, but I wouldn't stoop to petty cruelty. That's a different game. The plan emerged like layers. Phase 1, catalog and secure. Phase 2, reclaim presence. Phase 3, controlled exposure. Phase 4, closure by success. I didn't call them that out loud. I kept them in my head. It made things feel less like revenge and more like strategy meeting reality. The tension I felt every morning was channeled into tasks. Little victories accumulated. Rebuilding my bank account. Reconnecting with friends who mattered. Showing up to my kids' lives not broken but whole. Every time I booked a new client at work or finished a training session that would have crushed me a year ago, my satisfaction felt like a brick in a growing wall. Obstacles began showing up immediately, like dogs sniffing out the scent of something foreign in the neighborhood. The first was my own family's silence. You don't understand how paralyzing it is to be abandoned on moral grounds by people who taught you your first prayers. I tried one more time to reach out to my parents with measured words. No accusatory fireworks, just, "I miss you." The silence that replied wasn't empty, it was purposeful. My mother's avoidance became a riddle I had to solve. I tested small prods, casual drops about the kids, about mundane things that would show whether they were willing to be in my life in any meaningful way. Nothing. No birthday messages, no texts, no pictures of grandchildren. That sting didn't go away, so I put it in a box and moved on. My brother, the rat, was more complicated. He'd always been the dramatic attention seeker, the guy whose life was one poorly planned decision after another. But this time, his actions had real consequences. He'd rallied against me on thin air. He'd become an accomplice to a story that painted me violent. It was cowardice, and I needed to expose it for what it was. But I couldn't just go viral with, "He lied." You live in a small place. People take sides quickly and forget facts slower. So I set traps. Not illegal traps, nothing that would get me in trouble, just situations where a pattern of behavior would reveal itself. I'd arrange neutral family gatherings, invite mutual friends, and subtly steer conversations to the things that mattered. Reliability, past choices, who actually showed up for whose children, who had a record of stepping up, and who had a record of running away. The goal was to allow people to reconcile memories with facts without me having to plaster shame across someone's face. There were close calls. He found out I had been saving texts to a private drive and accused me of hoarding evidence like a criminal. He tried to shame me publicly in front of the kids, calling me vindictive, a liar. I'd prepare for those moments. A calm face, a deep breath, a refusal to engage in his theater. I learned early on that when someone wants to project, the drama feeds them. Deny them the stage, and their words lose power. But more dangerous were the times when my control nearly slipped. One evening, a mutual friend texted me a link to a gossip post. Someone had noticed him with the other woman at a cafe and posted speculative comments. My first impulse was to respond with fire, to call him out publicly and burn him down. Instead, I took a screenshot and put it in the evidence folder. I smiled, put on my coat, and went out for a run. Anger is a fuel, valuable but volatile. If you don't funnel it into something that lasts, it flares and dies. There was a legal wrinkle I hadn't expected: his attempts to minimize the public effect. Because the divorce had been uncontested and clean, he thought he'd dodged consequences. He believed, ridiculously, that the legal system would erase the personal damage he had created. But a court document doesn't stop social truth. So I began opening small, controlled leaks.
not slanderous accusations, but clarity. I wrote an op-ed about betrayal and resilience under a pseudonym and found it shared by hundreds. It resonated because betrayal is universal. I didn't name names, but people in our town knew the silhouette. I sent quiet messages to a few people who mattered, the neighbors, the teachers at our kids' school, the business owners we both knew, sharing evidence in a calm, non-aggressive way. If you ever hear a story, here's what really happened. I saw heads tilt. People began to check back in with me, the ones who had been unsure. It wasn't explosive. It was steady, a drip that, over months, turned into a stream.
It's important to say revenge for me wasn't purely about him. It was about reclaiming my narrative. When your life's story has been hijacked by an abuser and then someone else rewrites it again for you, your brother, your mother, the most satisfying revenge is to become the author again. I started writing. I wrote late at night, letters that I never sent, diaries, and a piece about being unseen. It was for me, but it became for everyone when a friend suggested I expand it into a piece for a local magazine. I hesitated, felt the old shame flare up, but then realized the power of testimony. I could be the quiet person in the corner who refuses to be erased. What's a better revenge? To see him fall, or to rise so high that his fall is irrelevant? I wanted both. One of the most tense moments came when my brother showed up with a pack of questions from my mother. They had invited him to mediate, or so they said. My mother wanted a family sit-down. I almost didn't go. The thought of sitting across from the trio of people who had judged me for wanting to live honestly turned my stomach into ice. But I went anyway and practiced my calm like a sport. That conversation was theater. My brother came with a smug, self-righteous air as if moral clarity was his birthright. My mother wore a sad, disappointed face like a costume. My ex sat there distant, as if he'd been invited only for historical accuracy. I walked in with a folder. Not slammed down on the table, mind you, just quietly placed. It contained sanitized, factual statements, dates, screenshots, summaries of conversations, not rhetoric, not fireworks. When I spoke, I kept my voice steady. I want you to see the timeline for what it was. I'm not asking you to take my word. I'm offering facts. They shifted in their seats. The look on my brother's face, the first crack of self-image showing, was subtle but real. He stammered. He tried to show me up with recollections of my anger, and I nodded. I wasn't pristine. I'd been angry. But I closed every open loop with evidence. After that meeting, there was silence. That silence was not triumph. It was exposure. He had to retreat. But you don't win by documents alone. People are complicated and messy, and a legalese folder doesn't change a mother's heart. What changed my mother's view wasn't a paper. It was watching me with my children in a way that spoke 1,000 truths at once. I showed up at school events, taking photos with the kids, hosting dinners where laughter returned as an undermastered soundtrack, being present. People started to comment on the difference. She looks happier, they would say. That infuriated him. It made him bark that I was performing. Let them think I performed. If living happily and fully is performance, hand me a stage and a spotlight. The dagger of their approval had been used to wound me. I took that same dagger and used it to cut ties clean. There were tactical missteps, I'll be honest. Once, in a moment of human weakness, I leaked an old message to someone who promised discretion. That person didn't keep it. A rumor spun out, and for 2 weeks I felt like the town had turned into a wash of murmurs. My brother called me hysterical. My ex used it as ammo. I wanted to crawl into the ground. But I learned something there. Control is not total. People will make choices you don't like. but the story you tell consistently is the story that sticks. So I doubled down on consistency. I started a small, controlled public presence that wasn't about revenge, but about me. A blog where I wrote about training for a race, about mental health, about the quiet injustice of being gaslit. At first, only a few people read it, then more. Then someone forwarded a piece to a local reporter who asked to interview me about resilience. That interview ran. Suddenly, the town saw me not as a caricature, but as a person who had built herself back up. The effect was cumulative. The more I put myself forward, calmly and confidently, the less traction his lies had. That was the tipping point strategically. People began to separate the man from the myth. Parents who had been polite to him at PTA meetings started inviting me to coffee. A teacher I'd barely spoken to handed me a card and said, "Your kids are lucky." Those words were small, but they were truth. And truth spreads in ways that gossip cannot fully smother. Close calls kept happening because dramatic people don't go quietly. My ex started dating casually, and rumor networks in small towns are fast. I saw him with the other woman once at a grocery store. They looked awkward and small, like two people pretending to be something they weren't. It gave me no joy. I recognized it as stagecraft that had lost its light. My brother started to stop showing up to family events where I'd be present. People sent me messages. "He's been talking about you." I let the messages pile up. I didn't answer the taunts. Silence is sometimes the loudest reply. And then there was the slow, delicious public recalibration. Nothing explosive, no dramatic social media posts, but just a subtle rebalancing. Friends who had stepped away started to come back. Colleagues who had been awkward at the office began to treat me like someone who was justified and resilient. The town's perception shifted from the crazy wife to the woman who rebuilt herself. That shift created a kind of social sanction that his mother and brother could not ignore for long. It was not punitive in the criminal sense, but it was a consequence. People choose where to place their loyalty, and public loyalty has weight. When people distance themselves, missing dinners and not inviting him to events he used to attend like it was a social bank account being closed, it accumulates. I must be honest. There were moments where I wanted him to feel pain in ways that are indefensible. I imagined him being humiliated in front of his peers, losing a job, feeling alone as I had been. But there's a difference between vengeance that ruins lives and consequences that reflect reality. I didn't want to ruin him. I wanted the truth to align with perception. When he started experiencing the cold shoulder in certain circles, when opportunities that required social warmth didn't manifest, that wasn't orchestrated cruelty. It was people making decisions based on new information. That distinction matters. It kept me morally intact. I refused to be someone who abused power because I had been abused. That's an important kind of revenge. Don't become the monster whose footsteps you once followed. One night, almost a year into the slow rebuilding, I received a message from a woman I had never met. She wrote, "I'm his ex." Her message was blunt and apologetic. She said she had been watching interviews, had seen the pieces I wrote, and felt the weight of her own mistakes. She wanted to apologize for not telling me earlier. The message was a mix of sadness and relief. I responded with a version of what I had learned. "Thank you for telling the truth now. It matters. It would have mattered then, but truth is always a thing." That exchange was oddly liberating. There was no teleporting back in time to stop the pain, but there was an acknowledgement that sometimes people find their moral backbone late, and when they do, it can help balance the ledger. You may be wondering, where is the dramatic crash? Where's the glorious public unmasking with torches and pitchforks? Truthfully, the most satisfying moments were quiet.
The time my son hugged me and said, "You're my hero," after I ran a local charity race and raised funds for mental health hit deeper than anything intended to shame him. The time my daughter looked at me and said, "You look like you're back," felt like a verdict. The revenge that mattered was not revenge on him so much as revenge on the idea that I was powerless. I had power now, cultivated through small, steady choices that added up to a life with dignity. But there was one scene I can't skip because it was cinematic in its irony. He had arranged a small get-together at a cafe, an attempt, I suspect, to remind mutual acquaintances that his life was fine and to tacitly suggest anyone who might have wondered that everything was normal. A mutual friend, the kind who had watched the situation unfold quietly, invited me on impulse. I didn't arrive to confront him, but to be myself, composed, warm, alive. He saw me enter. You could map the moment on his face. Surprise, calculation, then an awkward attempt at politeness. He introduced me to someone by saying, "She's doing well." The someone's eyes, curious and polite, then drifted to me, and in the space of a conversation, they could see the woman I had become. No raised voices, no spectacle. He left that gathering looking like a man who was trying to
swim against the current. You've seen those moments in films. The crowd's attention shifts, and the actor who once owned the stage suddenly finds the lights cooler and dimmer. That's what true social consequence feels like. It's not instantaneous. It's a rebalancing where legitimacy migrates from the liar to the truth teller. I want to pause and ask you something. If you were me, would you have taken those small victories as finishing points? Or, like me, would you press forward until the moral ledger balanced? I pressed forward, not for cruelty, but for closure. I wanted a life where I didn't have to justify my existence to the people who chose to believe convenient lies. I wanted children who could look back and say, "My mother stood up." I wanted my own reflection to belong to me again. There were setbacks. A mutual friend once told me that my brother had been spreading a rumor about my mental health as a reason to explain why I was pushing this agenda. It stung. Because I had been so public about my recovery, it felt like a betrayal to see my history used as an excuse to undermine me. But I responded the only way that kept my hands clean. I let time do the work. I kept being present, kept being consistent. People are more complex than gossip, and eventually the truth cut through. The power of reliability is underestimated. A consistent person will outlast a rumor. As months turned into a year, the final scaffolding of my revenge, that is, the true alignment between who I was and how others saw me, fell into place. It wasn't dramatic, it was inevitable. My ex's attempts at social maneuvering became clumsy. Friends who had been polite to him drifted to neutral, then to distant. My brother found the family table a little colder, invitations less frequent. My mother, in a rare show of contact, sent a message that read like a diplomatic communiqué. Short, offering holiday well-wishes, but no admission of guilt. That was their closer, perhaps. There was no explosive meltdown, no enraged public meltdown. There was only the quiet collapse of the myth that they had preferred. It's a strange kind of satisfaction to watch a structure of untruths slowly crumble, not because you tore it down, but because its foundations were always rotten. And through all of that, the internal work was happening too. Retraining your own mind away from survival mode is a slow alchemy. When you've been gaslit, you doubt your memory, you question your instincts. The revenge that mattered was the return of trust in myself. The day I could hear my own inner voice without flinching was the day I realized I'd won something permanent. There's a practical lesson in this, and I say this because you asked for a story that people can sit with. Revenge doesn't have to be explosive to be complete. Small, consistent acts of self-respect create social consequences that are cleaner and more enduring than any act of sabotage. I learned to refuse the quick, intoxicating satisfaction of a gotcha moment in favor of long-term dignity. Ironically, that's what stung him more. He'd built himself into a person who could take advantage of silence. When silence no longer protected him, he shrank. I'm not naive. I still have nights where I wonder if I could have done more earlier or whispered kinder things to my younger self when she was on that bathroom floor. But those nights are fewer. And when they come, I anchor back to actions that sustain real life. Training for the next race, helping my kids with a project, visiting a friend in the hospital. Those daily commitments make it harder for me to revert to the old scripts. They're my armor. So where did revenge end and healing begin? They braided together like two ropes that support the same bridge. The plan that once read like a blueprint for retaliation became a map for reclamation. When my brother called once, years later, to ask if I would join the family for a funeral, I said no. That could have been the moment of ultimate mercy or ultimate cruelty. I chose mercy for myself. I sent flowers with a note that read, "I'm thinking of you." They would interpret it however they wanted to, but I slept that night knowing I had acted like the woman I wanted to be, composed, benevolent, and not beholden to their approval. If I had to summarize the core of it, the thing I hope you take away from this long middle section of my story, it's this: power the way you can, with what you have that's moral and sustainable. Gather your evidence, protect your finances, be present for the people who actually matter, and restore yourself with disciplined, everyday action. Don't become the villain to punish a villain. Let the truth and your consistent life do the heavy lifting. And sometimes, if you let life do the work, those who once hurt you will feel the consequences without you having to become cruel. That's a better ending than any revenge fantasy I had ever had. By the time part 3 came calling, the part where things could have tipped into something darker, I was ready. Not because I had manufactured a masterstroke, but because my life had been rearranged into a shape that no longer allowed me to be anyone's punching bag. The pressure I'd built had been released through dignity, through public truth, through the small, unglamorous acts of reinvention. And as for him, well, the man who had walked away with his head full of lies found that his audiences had thinned. That, ultimately, was the downfall I wanted. The slow, quiet evaporation of support for a man who had been the center of my old world. So when you ask whether I waited too long, my answer is complicated. If you're driven by a need for immediate payback, I'll be candid. It's intoxicating but temporary. If you want longevity, if you want the kind of resolution that leaves you intact, patient planning and reconstruction is the more surgical route. Which would you have chosen in my shoes? I did it. I'm not saying that lightly. Those words are a small, private truth tucked into the end of a long, quiet reckoning. The climax of what I began scheming a year ago wasn't a single wildfire moment. It was a sequence of collapses, each one small but precise, until the whole fragile facade crumbled. If you're sitting there wondering whether I orchestrated a dramatic unmasking, let me be clear. I did not stage a public humiliation the way you might see in a movie. Instead, I watched the world I'd known rearrange itself so that the people who had chosen lies found themselves living inside those lies until the house of cards they'd built could no longer hold a single breath. I'll tell you step by step how it fell apart, because if you've been betrayed, maybe you want to know that consequence can be quiet, dignified, and complete. The last act began with momentum I'd created through months of steady, methodical action. I'd rebuilt my health. I was showing up to kids' events, to runs, to work with presence. That presence became my currency. People noticed the consistency, the phone calls I answered, the time I spent, the conversations I actually listened to. Social capital accumulated like snowpack. It looked harmless. It was not. It was the snow that became an avalanche. The avalanche didn't launch from me delivering a dramatic speech. It launched from others finally seeing the pattern and deciding they didn't want to be part of a story that painted truth as falsehood. One early morning, I learned that a mutual friend had pulled 3 local business owners aside, people who usually exchange pleasantries with him at community events, and quietly shared the timeline I had given them months earlier. This wasn't gossip. It was a factual, tempered recount. Dates, screenshots, the slow hours of messages that proved he had chosen someone else over his marriage for years. Those businessmen weren't interested in drama. They were interested in trustworthiness. In a town where recommendations and relationships feed into livelihoods, being seen as unreliable matters. The next week, one of those businesses declined an event he'd hoped to be a part of. It was a small refusal,
But in that town, small refusals ripple fast. You might think that's petty, but the truth is, social currency is a real thing. Reputation is a fragile commodity. People choose who to rely on. He had already burned the deepest trust of his closest kin, mine, and now the outer layers of his social network began to thin. Invitations stopped trickling in. The calls that used to be so easy, the casual coffees, the weekends that had once been open to him, started having tight margins. People who were neutral had slowly moved towards me because I was the reliable friend, the one whose words were followed by action. The natural law of small towns is that when choices must be made, most people pick the steady hand over the one who has revealed a pattern of deceit. Of course, my brother was a different animal. He wasn't just a social acquaintance. He was blood. His fall had to be handled with care. I wanted exposure, yes, but not vindictiveness for the sake of cruelty. The key to his undoing was letting him reveal who he was through his own behavior. I began to accept invitations he expected me to ignore, to attend gatherings where mutual friends would casually mention the ways he had relied on our parents to bail him out. I didn't call him out directly. I let the truth show itself in the gaps. People began to talk about the times my brother asked for money, the half-finished projects, the rehabs without real follow-through. He had built his image on stories that were convenient to him. The more his patterns were retold by people who'd seen them repeatedly, the less room there was for his self-justifying narrative.
I'll never forget the day that crystallized it. A neighbor I'd once coached with, a woman who'd been friendly with my brother for years, pulled me aside at a charity event and said, "I didn't realize how much I'd been covering for him until I saw how you keep showing up." She wasn't accusing, she was realizing. Her words carried weight because she was someone my brother assumed would always side with him. The shift didn't happen overnight, but one by one, the people who'd been his soft landing spots started to see his patterns and step back. Invitations for things that required reliability, speaking slots, volunteer work, committees, stopped going his way. He resisted, of course. He tried to charm and to manipulate, but consistency is a mirror that shows you for who you are. And he was starting to see his reflection for the first time without the aid of stories he'd told himself. My mother's slow disillusionment was perhaps the most complicated and the most satisfying in a way I didn't expect. She didn't have a spectacular collapse. She had small, precise reckonings with her conscience. The person who had always been able to rationalize anything began to find fewer and fewer rationales left that didn't sound hollow even to her. That's what I learned about people who are expert gaslighters. Their explanations work as long as someone continues to accept them. Once their audience quiets, their own inner voice becomes louder. It's a lonely place to sit with no one to validate your version of events. I didn't revel in my mother's growing discomfort. I watched it like a scientist watches a reaction. She called fewer times. She sent perfunctory holiday notes. She no longer interceded on his behalf. For someone who had been weaponized against me, her silence felt like justice. One of the most potent engines of the climax, though, was truth-telling that came from unexpected places. A woman, a coworker of his, someone who had been treated kindly by him in the past, contacted me. She'd heard a whisper. She wanted to confirm a timeline for something she'd seen. She was kind, careful, and at the end of our conversation, she said, "I don't know you, but I think I should have called you earlier." A cascade of other small confessions followed, not dramatic confessions, but quiet acknowledgments from people who had seen pieces and suddenly saw the whole. They didn't want my revenge, they wanted accuracy. Those messages multiplied the effect of everything I'd been doing. Truth, once released, doesn't need a megaphone. It expands to fill the space of the lie. There was one particularly cinematic moment that felt like the last gasp of his old life. He'd been invited to a local charity gala, an event that he always liked to attend,
to stay visible. He assumed the night would be a performance, the same one where he smiled and was charming to those who still tolerated him. I knew he'd be there. A mutual friend tipped me off, as a courtesy. I didn't plan to confront. I didn't need to. I arrived in a simple dress, with no fanfare, and sat near the back. As the evening unfolded, the person all the hosts thanked was not him. Invitations were extended to me for subsequent committees. When the music slowed and the room broke into small groups, he found fewer people to orbit. A woman he tried to speak with tactfully excused herself and steered the conversation elsewhere. For a moment, he stood boxed in, a man whose circle had thinned to the point of visible discomfort. I felt no glee. I felt a fierce, quiet recognition. The social scaffolding he'd counted on to protect his image had been removed. You need to understand how much of this was not my doing alone. Yes, I catalyzed it by being consistent, by presenting facts when necessary, by living openly, but the real collapse came from collective recalibration. When enough people decide that someone you once counted on is unreliable, the community's decisions weave a reality that has consequences. I didn't have to ruin his career or his mind. I simply had to let the truth settle and the social fabric reweave without him at the center. Then there was the turning point that I had wanted more than anything. The moment my children saw, without being told, who their father really was, and chose to remain with me in small but meaningful ways. My kids had been through a lot, and I had been careful not to manipulate them. I wanted their truth to come from them. It did. My daughter came home one day, eyes tired, and sat with me on the couch. "Mama," she said, "I met his friend at school, and they asked about him, and I didn't want to say anything bad." She hesitated, then breathed. "But I said I felt safe with you, and that's what mattered." My son, more stoic, started spending more weekends with me, volunteering at the same charity races I ran. Those small choices, their choices, were the definitive reckoning for me. The man who had chosen to betray the core of his family now faced the most important consequence: the slow, ordinary choice of those he had hurt to be with someone else. I know you might be asking, did they ever apologize? Did they come begging? My mother sent a short message one winter, "I'm sorry for how things turned out." It wasn't a detailed apology, it was a hedged, careful word. My brother called once, voice tight, saying, "I've been thinking." He wanted to reconcile. I met him for coffee, and it was a polite conversation, not the explosive showdown some revenge fantasy script. He was older, quieter, and the bravado was gone. He seemed to feel the pebble throwing of his actions. I didn't humiliate him in public. I listened. I accepted a form of reconciliation that didn't pretend to rewrite what had happened. Maybe that makes me merciful? Maybe it makes me pragmatic. The truth is, I had wanted the consequences, not a show. A genuine small apology is more real than a shouting match that leaves everyone bloodied. Let me be clear about one thing. I never, at any point, crossed into violence. That is a line I refuse to cross. My revenge was never about destroying someone's life. It was about aligning consequences with actions, ensuring that those who had been nourished by lies had to live with the truth. If you're imagining dramatic break-ins, public shaming, revenge porn, or anything illegal, stop. Even when you've been wronged, that route drags you down to their level. I wanted to keep my dignity intact. I wanted the victory to be moral, not vengeful in a way that would haunt me later. The climax's final collapse was subtle and cumulative. He lost some small business opportunities, invitations dwindled, and when he attempted to re-enter social scenes, there was a polite but perceptible coolness. People started prefacing conversations with, "I didn't know that," or "We never heard the full story," followed by quiet nods. Where he once had a ready audience, people now had a quiet awareness that made them cautious. That's the real downfall, when you stop being the center and you become a cave of echoes. His mother no longer defended him in the way she used to. My brother's invitations shrank. The town's memory, touched by facts and by my steady presence, had rebalanced in my favor. I'll tell you about one more moment, because it felt like the end cap on an era. A few evenings after a school event, I found a note on my car. No signature, just a piece of paper that read, "Thank you for showing us how to be steady. You helped more people than you know." Whoever wrote it was anonymous, but the message said everything I needed. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't loud. It was quiet recognition. That little scrap of paper represented the network of people who had watched the slow recalibration and decided to act differently. That note was the final bell. The social scaffolding that supported his life of half-truths had been removed, one polite refusal and one changed heart at a time, until he was left with an accurate reflection of himself. And what about me? By the time those last pieces fell into place, I'd changed in ways that felt irreversibly good. I had shed the brittle skin of a woman who looked to others for validation and had grown into someone who trusted her own footsteps. Healing and justice braided together. My therapy sessions had taught me to identify my triggers. My training taught me to channel my energy. My work taught me to stand steady through criticism. Instead of nights spent desperately investigating his phone, I spent nights training for races, writing essays that later got picked up in a local column, and planning a small trip with a friend I'd reconnected with. The habit of showing up, to my kids, to friendships, to my own life, was the backbone of everything. So what did the fall feel like to him? I can't read his heart, but I can see its effects. He looked smaller in photos. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He tried to reweave his social fabric, but found threads missing where he'd ripped them out himself. He had to face a quieter kind of loneliness, not the dramatic, newsworthy kind, but the daily absence of people he assumed he could rely on. And that solitude, when it was his doing, carried a weight I didn't envy. It wasn't a gloating satisfaction I felt. It was a sober recognition that actions have consequences. I want to answer the question that I know is pushing at the back of your mind like a splinter. Would I do it the same way if I had to do it again? The answer is yes, with one conditional addendum. I would do it in the same measured way because I learned that measured consequences are more durable than dramatic revenge. But I would do so with more forgiveness for my younger self, the one who sat on that bathroom floor and thought her life had ended. I'd hold her a little tighter more often. That person deserves patience, not just strategy. You've probably heard people say, revenge is a poison you drink yourself. There's some truth to that. If your revenge becomes cruelty, if it morphs into a habit of harming because you can, then yes, you have poisoned your life. But there's a different moral that I discovered. When justice is aligned with dignity, when you choose to protect yourself and rebuild, when your actions are ethical and aimed at truth rather than humiliation, revenge loses its poisonous edge and becomes something like rightful consequence. That's what I wanted. I want to ask you again, because I genuinely want to know, if you'd been standing where I was, with a cheating spouse who gaslit you and family who sided against you, and you had the option to take a slow, steady path that reclaimed your life and rearranged social truth, or to choose a fast, scorched earth path that might have given you immediate satisfaction but harmed you in the long run, which would you choose? Be honest. I wasn't always that wise. Sometimes I wanted instant fireworks. But the slow, surgical approach has left my life whole. It left me feeling proud instead of hollow.
The denouement has been quieter than I once wanted. My brother calls less often now, but checks in about the kids. My mother sends a photograph of a flower and a short note. The ex, he sees the kids, he meets obligations, but there's a distance that didn't exist before. It's not cruel, it's clean. For me, the clean break and the steady rebuilding are the ultimate revenge. Where once I would have wanted him to fall with spectacular noise, now I know the purest satisfaction is waking up and finding that you're no longer pulled by the gravity of what others think. You are centered on your own values. And here is what I want you to remember, because it matters. Revenge and healing can coexist if you keep your compass set to dignity. Protect your finances, be indisputable with facts, rebuild your life with small, consistent acts, and do not let your wounds make you the thing you despise. That phrase, "look at what people do, not what they say," is the lens I live by now. Actions tell the truth. Words can be polished and forked, but actions fold themselves into consequences long before people notice. I will close with something simple and honest. On the day I ran that local half marathon, my daughter waited at the finish line with a poster she'd made. It read, "Mom, you're my hero." She hugged me hard. That hug collapsed everything back into perspective. All the plans, all the careful steps, every lonely night I spent in thought and therapy and spreadsheets and slow restitution, it all led to that moment. I felt both vindicated and healed. I had the victory I wanted, not because I'd orchestrated a public spectacle, but because the people who mattered knew the truth. So, what would you have done, really? Would you have waited, built a careful case, lived loud in your quiet way until truth found its audience? Or would you have chosen the quick burn, the reckless thrill that might leave you empty afterward? I'll tell you this, if someone told me revenge was the only end to the story, I might have considered darker paths. But because I learned how to build a life that no longer needed their approval, I can say I'm glad it turned out the way it did. Maybe the best revenge is not just to punish, but to live, and to live well. If you're still with me, thank you for listening. I don't know whether this is the ending or a new beginning. For now, it's both. An ending to a chapter of betrayal and the start of a life that I choose, day by day, with the people who choose me back. Would you have waited this long for payback? Would you trade a fast victory for a life rebuilt? Think about that, because at the end of the day, the real victory is waking up and feeling like you belong to yourself again.